Hi there, and welcome to I'll Knit If I Want To. I'm Andrea Mowry of Andrea Renee Knits, and let's jump into some questions. This is a weekly Q&A. You ask me questions, I try to answer them. I am wearing my Birds of a Feather shawl. This shawl, I designed the first time I ever went to Rhinebeck. Actually, this was my travel project. My son was only a few months old and I brought him with me. So it had to be like 6 years ago, just crazy. But it's called Birds of a Feather because I used one colorway in two different bases. So one is this lace weight and the other is a singles fingering weight. And I just love how they work together and that juxtaposition of same color, but different yarn bases. They're both from hedgehog fibers. I'm trying to remember the colorway name. It's been 6 years. I think it's either Teacup or Crybaby. No, I don't think that's a name of one. Is it Teacup? Darn, I even did some homework before today's and I didn't think to look up the colorway name, but that's okay. I'll link to it below if you want to check it out. And I'm actually wearing it with my studio tunic, which I've worn on here before. This is a sewing pattern by Sew Liberated. It's a tunic with giant pockets that just happen to be the perfect size for a skein of yarn. So it's a good knitting tunic. So you can walk around. I've gotten questions on especially people with young kids, you know, how do you fit in some knitting time? And my response is longer than what I'm going to give right now. I've talked about it in the past, but definitely top tip, always keep it with you. So big pockets, super helpful for that. If you don't have big pockets, a little really easy to carry like sling bag so that you just always have it because you never know when those young kiddos are gonna take a nap or get occupied with their own thing and not need you for a few minutes. And for those without children who are also trying to fit in that knitting time, you never know when you're gonna have to wait. You know, there's a lot of waiting in life. There's waiting in line. Like we have, especially when we lived back in Michigan in our old hometown, when the students would come back, we lived in a college town, all of a sudden the lines at the grocery stores, I mean, you'd be waiting for half an hour. So bring that knitting because you just never know when you're going to have this block of time where you could get some serious stitches in. Anyways, let's answer some questions. So I have a question about button bands. I am currently knitting the Douglas Cardi and I'm curious if there is a reason that you prefer to knit the button bands separate and then attach it versus picking up stitches and knitting it directly on. So if you look through my patterns, I do both. And there is a reason, mostly it's aesthetic. So I love, here's my Douglas Cardi. I love a vertical button band. I just really, really like the way it looks. And I don't necessarily like knitting it in tandem with the body because I want to work it on a smaller needle because I want that button band to have some stability, especially over time. I don't want it to stretch out because of being knit at a looser gauge, such as the body. So, excuse me. When you end up breaking it down, I find it simpler to just knit it separately and seam it in because then it's gonna be knit up at the gauge I want it and it's gonna have a little more strength. And I just really, really, really love the way that looks. Now, if you were like, no ma'am, I have no interest in seaming of any kind, you could absolutely modify and pick up a button band. Such as, here is my picked up button band on the Andrea cardigan. I actually didn't realize what similar color themes these two sweaters have until I was carrying them both up together. So there is a picked up button band that I then work out from the sweater. So the ribbing's horizontal instead of vertical. So it's just a different style. It's just a different way to do it. wanted a better word right there, and it just didn't happen. But yeah, so different strokes for different folks. You do you, but there are times when I really want that vertical look. And some people really don't like picking up stitches. So a vertical button band seamed in might be a really nice option instead of picking up stitches, or vice versa. Hi, Andrea. Hello. You inspired me to head to Rhinebeck for the Sheep and Yarn Festival. Yay! I've been knitting for 1.5 years now and would consider myself an advanced beginner. I've done a half fisherman's rib cardigan and made a few sweaters, many hats, etc. I'd say if you've done a half fisherman's rib sweater, like, you're maybe a little bit past an advanced beginner. And I signed up for a workshop at the festival. Oh, so fun. I signed up for the beginning Fair Isle knitting workshop and want to be prepared. What would you suggest for practicing and getting prepped for a workshop? Thanks so much. So, just reading the title of that class, the fact that it is a beginning class, I don't think you should need to do any prep. If I'm going to label a workshop beginner, I'm going to assume that the people attending my class, that there's a really good chance that they have never attempted that technique before. But every teacher is different, every class is different, so I highly recommend looking at any information you were given from the festival in regards to that specific class. So for instance, when I teach, I always give, covered in fuzzies, per the usual, I always give a list of supplies you're going to need or that I think are helpful. I'm also going to try to give a, not necessarily like, I never like to categorize levels because I just think it's all relative, and what one person finds easy, somebody else may not, or, you know, vice versa. So, how many times can I say vice versa in one episode? But so what I do is I try to kind of give like a little paragraph there of, here are the skill sets you need to know. So for instance, when I teach brioche, the only requirement I have is that you know how to both knit and purl, slip a stitch, and do a yarn over. If you already know how to do those 4 things, then you have enough information already in your arsenal to come take my class. So that's what I would look at. There's a good chance that they've given you some kind of guidance as for what you need to be comfortable with to take that class. So yeah, now that being said too, some of us get nervous going into a new class and we don't want to feel like we're walking in without knowing anything on the subject. So if that's how you're feeling and you just want to feel like a little bit prepared, you could absolutely practice on a swatch, just to give it a go and see how it feels in your hands. The only thing I'll say is sometimes then you might form a habit, or you know, you might get an idea in your head that the instructor might not do it the same way. And then that might actually trip you up a little bit if you then have to go back and adjust what you've learned because now they're teaching you something new, if that makes sense. So yeah, I think the best practice I recommend is always really reading through the class description and information from whoever's hosting the workshop so that you can make sure you're up to date. But if they say beginners welcome, no previous Fair Isle experience needed, you don't have to know anything. Just make sure you show up with whatever supplies they say you should have. We're ready to learn. I do recommend when you're taking a class, maybe bring a caffeinated beverage, especially if it's after lunch. My after lunch classes are always the toughest because people get so sleepy after lunch. So that's one thing. Like, make sure you get a good night's sleep the night before, and have had a nutritious meal beforehand, just so that you can focus on the information that you're getting. But yeah, that's kind of it. You can definitely scroll around here on YouTube if you want to even just watch some videos just to get kind of comfortable with things. But that's it. All right. Love your DRK everyday socks. Thank you. Would you please explain why you decided to rib the bottom of the foot and not just knit it? I, as many others, were always told one always knits the bottom of the foot because feet are so sensitive. Love all your patterns. Thank you. So, yes, I would be happy to explain that decision. My goal with the DRK everyday socks was to have a really comfortable, well-fitting sock. And I was thrilled with that. Was like one of my favorite, like, after I had gone through the testers that tested all those sizes, because that pattern is for like babies through adults, large size feet, and it fit everyone well. And I attribute that to the ribbing going all the way around the foot. The thing with hand knit socks that I have found, and you may feel very differently, but I just find that ribbed socks fit the best because they naturally want to pull in and hug the foot. And I appreciate having that ribbing going all the way around. And I find that it helps make up for small discrepancies in like yarn weights, because again, not all fingering weight yarn is the same. And you might have a skein that's 400 yards per 100 grams, and you might have another skein that's 470 yards for that 100 grams. And so I find by having the ribbing in that pattern, it helps make up for that because it pulls in so nicely around the foot. I've even knit them up in sport weight yarn successfully without any modifications to gauge. That being said, and I have never found ribbing under the sole of my foot to be uncomfortable in any way. I actually wear my DRK everyday socks way more. I mean, I wear all my hand knit socks very much, to the point where I actually looked through them and I was like, oh man, I need to start knitting some socks, because I'm wearing through them, because they're really all I wear unless I'm doing like some workouts. I'll wear my sport socks, but otherwise I am very much a wool sock wearer. And they are my most comfortable ones. They never like start to sag or anything. They just hug the foot really nicely. Now, if you do have very sensitive soles of your foot that the ribbing bothers you, what's interesting about that, sorry, I'm hopping around. I'm a hopper. I'm a thought hopper. The interesting thing about that is, generally speaking, if we really wanted to make something that was more comfortable for the bottom of our feet because they're so sensitive, you would actually want to knit the bottom of your sock in reverse stockinette. Because what you would want, like if you were worried about any agitation on the bottom of your foot, the smoothest fabric would be the knit side. So really you'd want to do a reverse stockinette soles so that the knit side is what's touching your foot, and having the purls on the outside. But I don't know if you've knit them yet, but try them and feel them. And if you're not wild about the ribbing, then you can really easily swap that out. You can honestly, just on that bottom needle, you could switch out to stockinette. And then you would just need to, when you start doing the heel gusset shaping, you would also keep that in stockinette instead of doing the ribbing instructions there. Also, I really liked the pretty ribbing shaping for the heel gusset. So that's another reason. But yeah, so there you go. That's just my own personal feelings. And that is why I made that decision. Next question. I love your Alpenglow sweater and I'm so excited for the knit-along. Yay! I am new to colorwork and having some trouble with catching my longer floats. I can always see the contrast color peeking through the fabric, which is especially bothersome in high contrast color work. I have resorted to not catching my floats and just being careful with the sweaters, but that isn't really a sustainable solution. How do you catch your floats? Are there any strategies to limit the amount that contrast yarn pokes through the front of the fabric? So this is a great question. I've actually gotten questions on yarn floats before, and I've always hesitated to answer them. For one, I just feel like I'm no expert on the topic. Sometimes, like, I'm like, oh, I don't know. I just kind of just start doing something. I don't know if I'm doing it the right way. So I think I've just always hesitated to say anything, but I do have a couple things. So one, you don't have to catch your floats. Yes, you do have to be careful when you're putting them on that you don't snag a finger somewhere. Really, where I would worry the most about that's actually just on sleeves. That's where I ever have an issue with like accidentally snagging a finger or a ring. In just a yoke, I don't find it to be that problematic. Also, especially if you're using maybe a woollier wool, because what's going to happen over time is you wear that sweater and you block it. Those fibers naturally start to kind of felt into each other and grab each other, and those floats are going to kind of like minimize themselves as they kind of mat together a little bit. If you're using superwash yarn, that's not going to happen, but just something to think about when you are, you know, you can see, okay, what yarns am I using for any specific project, and maybe I don't have to worry so much about the floats on this one because I'm using, you know, this really woolly wool. Now, when you do want to catch a float, one reason you might be seeing that contrast yarn come through is if, when you're going to catch that float, if you are taking the yarn that you want to catch and just, the yarn, I'm sorry, I'm trying to think of the best way to say that because I'm not demonstrating so that it's not confusing. Good news is I actually found a good tutorial. It's not one of mine, but I think it'll be helpful. So I'll link that below. So for those of you that are like me, who you need a visual, you can check that out. But I think what might be happening is if you are just carrying the yarn over to catch it, so you're just placing it over top of the yarn you're working with, as you then bring up the yarn you're working with to knit your stitch, it's pushing that contrast yarn through. And so that's why you're seeing it. Now, you can sometimes actually fix that during the blocking process, where if you just take a peek anywhere where you have some longer floats, you can kind of use like a tapestry needle or your fingers even, and just kind of like pull up the color that's on top so that the contrast color you don't want poking through goes to the back. And I think over time you won't notice it all that much. But what you really want to do, and this is where it gets a little confusing to try and just verbalize this, but basically after you've knit, let's say half your stitches, I generally catch my floats if it is 7 or more stitches that I'm carrying my float for. Another rule of thumb is every inch or 2.5 centimeters that you're going to have, like you don't really want to go beyond that as far as the length of a float, because that's when it starts to get long enough to start catching fingers and whatnot. So let's say I have my 7 stitches and I'm like, okay, this is longer than I want to just carry the float across the back. So I go to the middle. So I would knit 3, and then on the 4th stitch, I would insert my needle to knit. I would bring up my float yarn from underneath and place it on top of the needle. And then I would knit that stitch with my main color. And then what's going to happen is you don't knit into that stitch with that contrast color, your float color, but it'll fall over the back. It'll lock in. Basically, you will have caught your float. You'll have locked it in as you do that move, and it's wrapping it in a way so that it's not going to pop through. It's not just laying on top of the yarn. So I'm sorry if that's confusing, but I am going to put a link down there. So if you look below this video in the show notes, so in the description box, if you're having trouble finding it, it's always hard to point people to where to find the description box, because depending on how you're watching this video, whether it's on your phone or a tablet or a computer, it tends to move around for some reason. So just look for where it says the title. I'll knit if I want to. And you should see a little like shadow gray show more. Tap that and the whole thing will drop down, and that's where I list all of the questions I've just answered, and that's where I put all the links and everything. So you'll see a link right under this question for that tutorial. And if you have a favorite method for catching your floats, I'd love to hear it, because I'm trying to think. I think I probably I either learned how to catch my floats from Elizabeth Zimmerman, who's like my go-to for years and years and years when I got really into knitting as a late teenager, early 20s person, or knittinghelp.com. So knittinghelp.com is where I watched a lot of tutorials back when I was figuring out knitting, because I didn't really have any resources or people to go to learn things. So yeah, those were big ones. All right. What do you do with knits you no longer use or wear? For example, kids' clothes they have outgrown or gifted items, just not to your taste. Keep them as keepsakes, frog and reuse the yarn, donate. As my kids grow, I am trying to downsize and in a dilemma. So I thought this was a great question, because we've talked about what to do with like maybe yarn, you know, that we've grown out of, or sometimes that stash just grows without us even meaning to do that, and we just realize we have too much. So we have talked about kind of downsizing stash and where you can send yarn you're not going to use, but I don't think we've really talked about what to do with knits that we no longer use or that kids have grown out of. So really all of what you mentioned is a great idea. If the yarn is still in good condition and it's a yarn you loved, you can absolutely unravel and reuse that yarn. One thing that like my kids' school is always looking for cold weather clothing for kids, and they take donations. And so that's what we'll do even with like our winter gear. So that's the thing, you know, like young kids, I swear they need new snow pants and snow coat and everything, boots every year. They just grow so fast. So that's what we like to do, is we like to donate them to the school, so that other kids coming up in the grades below them or their siblings can utilize those. And so you can also do that with like hats, mittens, sweaters would be amazing. I mean, how great to get a hand knit sweater from someone, you know? I do also have a few things that I've pulled aside to keep just in case my children do decide to have children someday. I like the idea of them having something I made for them that they could now pass on to their kids. For instance, we have like a dress in my family that my mom wore, and then all of us wore, and my daughter wore it as well when she was really little. So I do think that can be really special if you just have like a couple, even just one per kid, that's just precious, that maybe you have some photos of them in too, because it's really fun to be able to look back and be like, here's the sweater you wore and here's a picture of you in it. And then you could also check with shelters would be a good place to donate to, and hospitals, although hospitals I find usually are looking more for really small knits like preemie hats and things like that. So there you go. There's some ideas. If anybody else has any ideas, feel free to throw them below. So I have been on a spinning whirlwind and it's been delightful. You can see right here, these are possibly going to be the sleeve yarn for my DRK Spin It to Knit It. You know what? I should grab what this fiber looks like. Let me grab it. Okay, little intermission's over. So this is from Wound Up Fiber Arts. And so this is what it looks like as the fiber fluff. There's a little bit of gray in here and white, which I love to neutralize some of that neon. And then it's like kind of an aqua teal, little bit of lime green and neon yellow. And I just think it would be kind of fun to have a really bright, like a neon neutral weekender. So this is my sample skein. You can't see it. Well, what will be my sample skein. So I am just spinning it as a traditional 3-ply. I divided the braid into 3 strips and spun them end to end. I have now rewound them onto bobbins so that I can ply them from where they all started, because that's what I wanted to do. And I have had some questions on that. I have, as I showed last week, I have a Hansen spinner, just right here. And there, oopsie, there is an attachment that you can purchase for this called the quill. It's buried under my sweaters I showed earlier, so I'm not going to show it right now, but it just looks like a metal rod that you stick into the end. and then you can put an empty bobbin on there and turn on the e-spinner, and you can wind yarn from one bobbin to another. And the reason I like to do that is, for one, the way I divided this yarn, I know that my starting point is all going to match up, but throughout the spinning process, your end isn't going to match up. Does that make sense? Because some of them, first of all, I'm sure I didn't divide it perfectly. And also just throughout the spinning, I tried to do it as evenly as possible, but some are going to end up longer than others. So if I start spinning at the butt of it, by the time I get to the starting point where I originally began, those aren't going to meet up anymore. So I wanted to start at their starting point for the plying. Also, I have experimented to see if it's worth it to rewind, putting, you know, so that it's in the same direction that I originally spun it. And I have found it really does create a smoother yarn. So I spun this with a short forward worsted draft, and I smoothed down that fiber as I was spinning it, and I want to keep that integrity. I do think that, like, it's not the worst thing in the world at all to not rewind, to wind your bobbins off, because I don't find that it overly roughs them up, them plying in the opposite direction. But I do like the smoothness you can get by putting them on to bobbins. I feel like that was, for some people, it's just gonna be a whole lot of gobbledygook that I just said, but some of you are gonna get it. So anyways, I am hoping this is actually my post recording this video, treat yourself, where I am going to hopefully begin to ply these. I probably won't finish today, but get that going. And then I think I said this in the last episode, but I have been loving doing combo spins. And so right now I am working on another one. So this is like 4 ounces of fiber each, and I have one more to go. This is all Hello Yarn club colorways, I believe. Yep, all of them are club colorways. So I have, it's that moment of like, oh, I don't know if I'm gonna pronounce that right. Nestle Road, Botany, and Just a Glimpse. So a lot of them, they have some purpley pinks. There is some aqua in there. There's some mustard yellow in one of these. So spun it from end to end, and then I am going to ply them. I don't think I'm gonna wind these off to start at the beginning again. And what has been really interesting about this is, one is Rambouillet, one is their limited edition American Wool Blend, and the other one is Corriedale. And just the difference between spinning those different fibers was really, really fun. Like realizing like, okay, I really have to change up some settings on my wheel. I need to adjust how I'm drafting. Like my Rambouillet drafting triangle compared to my American Wool drafting triangle was totally different, because the staple length in the American Wool was just way longer, and to be honest, easier to spin. It reconfirmed that I do think if you're a newer spinner, starting out with something that has a long staple length like Corriedale, I just think it is easier. So, and I'm ending with Corriedale, so I already know, I'm like, okay, this lesson's gonna be a breeze. But the softness and smoothness that this Rambouillet had was just really, really a delight. Yeah, that is the one I'm using, right? I don't need to worry about that right now. I'm just like, oh, this is also, that's fun. So my possible weekender sweater yarn is also Rambouillet, which actually has me doubting that that is what that is. I wonder if I grabbed the wrong fiber bag. It could be BFL. I don't think it is though. It might be. I might have grabbed the wrong bag. You don't care. It's okay. So that is what I'm doing with spinning. And yeah, I guess that ties this up for this week. So thanks for joining me. I I hope you have a great weekend. I hope you get to make some things, maybe bake some things. I just baked off a batch of gluten-free cupcakes that I'm going to turn into strawberry shortcake cupcakes for my mother-in-law's birthday today. And I found a fabulous recipe from the Loopy Whisk. Their cookbook is called Bake to Perfection, but they're on Instagram as the Loopy Whisk. And I used to be a baker, as I've mentioned before, and these are the closest I have gotten in taste to the cupcakes I used to make when I worked at a bakery. So I'm excited to go finish those off today. It was fun to get baking. I haven't baked anything in a while, so maybe you'll do some baking this weekend, or spinning, sewing, weaving. I am excited to get back into weaving soon, so once I do, I'll share that too. But I hope you have a lovely weekend, and I hope to see you back here next week. Bye.